Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Bull City Coordinators Duke Football Podcast. I'm going to skip all the typical intro stuff because this is not going to be our usual Duke football chat. However, I think it's going to be very educational. And if it's not, at least I will be entertained. And that's really, all that matters. So, um, before we get into what we're going to talk about today, I did want to bring up one thing this morning. I saw an article because I know a lot of you who listen are suffering through Carolina Panthers fandom or sadness or misery, whatever term you want to use. I mean, it is what it is. It's a raging dumpster fire on a good day. Um, I did want to say, I read an article where it talked about nobody knows what's going on with the coaching search because it's Tepper. And as I was trying to set my expectations for this next iteration of the Carolina Panthers franchise, I just want to go back to one thing that I have learned over the years and firmly believe in, and it is primarily that people do not change who they are at their core. They generally remain the same, and you just have to hope that they can moderate their worst behavioral instincts. Nothing that David Tepper has done as owner should give you any belief that he will do that. Do not get your hopes up. Do not fool yourself like I did when Frank Reich and his staff got hired that, oh, we're going to have a shot to be good. Don't believe it. Make him prove it. Because if there's one thing that we've seen from David Tepper, it is that he cannot moderate his worst behavioral instincts. And speaking of people who did not moderate their worst behavioral instincts, and this is not a comment on our next guest, but the subject about who our guest has written extensively about, which is Julius Caesar, former dictator in perpetuity of the so-called Roman Republic. Okay. He did not learn to moderate his worst behavioral instincts, and then he ended up murdered in the Roman Senate. So that is a long way to get into our next topic, which is one of my favorite, as my son calls them, side quests that I engage in, which is the history of ancient Rome. We have an expert in that area who teaches at the College of Charleston, my alma mater. She has written many articles, and she's going to tell us about some books, that one that she has written and one that is in the works. And we're going to have hopefully a very informative discussion about one of my favorite areas of study, which is ancient Rome. Our next guest is Dr. Jennifer Gerrish. How are you?
I am great, Ben. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, thank you for making time for this. Again, I'm very much looking forward to it. And one of the things that I like to do with guests is go a little bit into their origin story, how they got into what they're doing currently. So, could you tell us your ancient Rome classics origin story?
Absolutely. It actually begins in ancient Greece rather than ancient Rome. I took a class in college on ancient Greece and I was enjoying it. And then we got to a discussion of the fifth century in Athens, which is kind of, it's when democracy came into being. Then Athens got into this big war with Sparta and the state was sort of falling apart. And there was this young politician named Alcibiades who sort of came to prominence by promising the Athenians that if they just followed him, they could be restored to their former glory. And the Athenians are like, that's awesome, glory, that's what we want. We will do whatever you want us to. And he leads them into a disaster. He convinces them to invade Sicily. It's catastrophic. And then he defects to Sparta. He just dips right out of there to avoid consequences. And the Athenians are upset and they start losing the war. And about 5 years later, they let him come back to Athens. And for me, as a college student, this was what drew me to the classical world, was the idea that there was a state, Athens, that was so badly broken, they needed this guy back because he spoke to who that they thought they were. He spoke to this base desire that they had for glory. And so, despite everything they knew, they were willing to follow this guy anywhere. And so, for me as a young student, what I wanted to know was how does a state become so broken that it's willing to follow a demagogue or an autocrat. And then I moved on to ancient Rome when I got into graduate school and found very much the same thing happening there as well.
And history, everyone learned their lesson. It never repeated itself again.
It's so good that it worked out like that. I mean, basically, I should be unemployable since we did figure it all out.
Well, you were kind enough to send me some of your articles, which I digested with interest, and you had a great line in your one about Caesar, which was the greatest currency in antiquity was antiquity, which really, to, and I'm going to go off topic a little bit of the order that I had planned. That ability to appeal to somebody's golden age or things were better than has always remained a powerful currency. And I'm just curious how you teach that. I remember one of my film professors at College of Charleston said, if you watch a movie that takes place in a historical period of time, like let's say that Casablanca came out today, it wouldn't matter what it's really saying about how bad the Nazis were then. It's more important what it's saying about people today. And I'm just curious how you kind of deal with that as you talk about modern parallels and areas where you can draw on, hey, guys, this is why we study this stuff because it occurs again.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a starting point for those conversations with my students, I like to refer them to an author named Thucydides. He's a Greek author. He's actually from the same moment as that guy Alcibiades from the 5th century at Athens. And he writes a history of that very war I was talking about. And so he says, okay, this is the greatest conflict that has ever taken place. And so I am going to write about it so that when these things happen again, because human nature is unchanging, you will know what to do differently. And he uses this phrase, he says, kata to anthropinon, according to human nature, things will happen in the same way over and over again. And so I always use that as a starting point to say, as long ago as the 5th century, and this is the 5th century BC in Athens, there was a conception that human nature is fundamentally unchanging. And this gets at what you were speaking about in your introduction just now. And so to kind of use that as a lens for looking at the educational value of history, right? Because even though we're talking about people who spoke different languages and had different political structures and economies, if we believe that as people, we still want the same things, right? Like we want on the positive side, we want to make connections, among and between communities. We want to be able to feed our families. We also want to conquer people and we want to take their things. None of this has changed. And so, if we kind of accept that as our starting point for studying history, then we can look at ancient Greece and say, okay, the names and the details are different, but what are the human motivations here? And how do we see those playing out in our own world as well? And so when we think of it that way, you can study any period of history and get a lot out of it.
It's funny what you said about things will happen the same way over and over again. It reminded me of Battlestar Galactica, the reboot, where all this has happened before, all this will happen again, and the line from True Detective about time being a flat circle. And when I was reading, I had to stop when we got to the conquest of the Belgic tribes of Caesar's conquest of Gaul. Um, and I'm gonna go out of order, and I apologize for that. But I was thinking as I was reading that, I was saying to myself, man, if Caesar were around today, he would make a killing as a political consultant or a spokesperson for a campaign. I mean, could you talk a little bit about what made Caesar maybe unique amongst the Romans of his era?
Yeah, I think he is fascinating. I do want to say, as a disclaimer up front, Caesar was a total dirtbag. Caesar committed many acts of genocide. He violated the Roman constitution. He seized the government by force. All of this is true, and what makes him both interesting and difficult to talk about. Setting that aside, what Caesar accomplished so brilliantly that his rivals did not was that he was able to appeal to the Roman people in a way that made them more loyal to him than to the Roman state. So he sort of cultivates this sense of identity among his soldiers, these guys who are with him. He's in Gaul. You mentioned the campaign against the Belgae. He's up there in Gaul for 8 years, and these guys serve with him the whole time. He cultivates a sense that this is his army, not the Roman army. And he's also able to do that with the Roman people to sort of speak to their anxieties, their concerns about what their lives are like in a way that sort of fortified him against political opposition. So I think as a political thinker and as a, what we today would call a strategist, that's what he gets right, is sort of the ability to weaponize the discontent of common people and employ that to protect him against his rivals among the aristocracy.
And he also would not have abandoned Rome if he had been in a different, in Pompey's situation as well. That was really just bad leadership on his part. But you mentioned him being a complete dirtbag, and he was very power hungry, obviously. Just thinking about the way you phrased it, I can't get it out of my mind, but it's so accurate. But his writing style I was really blown away by because he did what a lot of people do is they present themselves as a reluctant warrior, like, oh, I didn't want to go fight, the Gauls or the Celts or whichever term you want to use. So they just kind of forced me to do it. And I was thinking the whole time that if you were talking to his opponent, they'd be like, then why are you bringing all these soldiers up here just waiting to go from one side of the Alps to the other? Like what's happening? But he seemed like very skilled at the art of political manipulation. Is that right?
It's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think your comments about sort of his writing style have a lot to do with it. One thing that for the, first, I don't know, 2000 years that people studied Caesar that we didn't really talk about was what a good writer he was, not just from a mechanical perspective. He uses nouns and verbs correctly and nicely, but in terms of the kind of sleight of hand that he's able to use to make himself look better. So, when he's building up to in book 2 of his Gallic Wars books, when he's campaigning against the Belgae, he almost gets destroyed by them. It's this battle at a place called the Sabis River. The Belgae outsmart him, they ambush him, and yet the way he tells the story, you never think that he's going to lose. There's just enough drama to keep you interested, but the way that he frames it and uses sort of foreshadowing to make it sound like, well, they did ambush us, but I, Caesar, was prepared for this, and here is how I responded. It's very clever because it's not overt. It's all done through insinuation and implication. He's never going to say, I, Caesar, am the awesomest commander ever. And in fact, he never even says, I, Caesar, am the commander. He talks about himself in the third person. And so it's through all of these sort of tricksy moves that he becomes so politically persuasive. Because if someone just comes out right and says, like, I'm the best, I'm, bigly great at running an army and all of this, you're sort of like, okay, well, take a seat, guy. But Caesar is able to let you come to that conclusion yourself. And again, I think that's one thing that makes him really unique among the political class at that time.
And one of the things that you wrote about in your article, and that some of the other podcasts that I listened to about Roman history talked about, is how his dispatches from the campaigns were read, and it seemed like it was more than just kind of an official report to the Senate. It was for public consumption, correct?
Yes, there's a bit of disagreement, or I shouldn't say disagreement, uncertainty among scholars about what exactly was sent home. So we'll say what we have today. So if you go into Barnes and Noble and you see, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars on the bookshelf, what we think that is something that Caesar wrote year by year as he was in Gaul, that he wrote up these narrative accounts of his campaigns. The ones that we have, I think, are the ones he sent to be read out loud to the Roman people, as well as to be read by the Senate. There's a separate thing that it was sort of like a bullet point letter report kind of thing that Roman generals would send to the Senate on an annual basis. What we don't know is the relationship between that and what we have. So it's possible that those Senate reports he used as like the cliff notes to write up this more elaborate thing that we have. So the kind of short answer is yes, that's probably what these are. We're just not entirely sure about the relationship. But I do think what we have was meant to be read out loud to the Roman people. And that's how ordinary folks back in Italy would know all about what he was doing while he was still, however many kilometers away.
Which gets us into an interesting point, and I was thinking about this as I was listening to the Emperors of Rome podcast, which does a good job going through the historiography issues that are there and the credibility and the reliability of the sources. Sometimes it's hard to know really what exactly transpired, other than we know, he was assassinated. Okay. But take his Gallic campaigns. I wonder exactly how accurate our understanding of what actually occurred in those campaigns are, and if you could comment on that in any way.
Yeah, it is really difficult when your main source for something is the guy who did the thing. Yeah, it has all of those questions of credibility. So we can say a few things about it. Generally speaking, we believe that his account of the events in Gaul is more or less accurate. Um, the battles he describes have largely been independently confirmed by archaeology. In some cases, we haven't been able to find the battle site, and they're sort of, squabbling about, oh, was it, 20 kilometers from where Paris is today, or was it 30 in the other direction, or something like that. But a lot of archaeological remains exist, some traces of the Gallic forts and things like that. So in terms of the basic timeline of it, we feel pretty confident. Another reason it would have been hard for him to blatantly fabricate anything is that he's not alone up there, right? He's got a number of lieutenants, these guys called legates, who are sort of the political class. And then you've got all of these soldiers who are going back to Italy and talking about the campaigns. So he can't totally make stuff up. So for the most part, we feel like the basic outline of it is probably quite accurate. Where there is a little bit of room for manipulation are places like casualty counts. He definitely seems to have inflated numbers of Gallic casualties. Does not talk about his own casualties, which is sort of interesting. He does not want to ever give us that number. And then other things he exaggerates are like his speed. He'll tell us it, I was able to, travel from the RR River to wherever in 4 days. And we can look at that today and say, oh, that is not actually, humanly possible. But in terms of, as I said, the basic of events, it does seem to be probably accurate. Of course, it's hard to independently verify it because we don't have other contemporary descriptions of it. And of course, anybody who wrote about it later, where do you go to do your research? Well, you pick up Julius Caesar's own account of it. So.
Well, it makes it a little bit easier if you're trying to preserve your narrative, if there's a series of decades long political purges that follow you to wipe out your resistance. So,
Yeah,
so
it certainly helps.
right. One thing, though, you talked about the archaeology, and you've mentioned that you took some Greek history classes, and I'm just curious. as I've read some of these articles and looked at some of these primary sources, which I have back on my shelf now somewhere, um, there's kind of a language barrier to picking that up that I've got to work through. But how important has archaeology become to what you do? And also, I'm just curious how solid of a classical language background do you need to have to really get at all this?
Yeah, those are both good questions. So on the first one, I'm not an archaeologist. Like, I don't dig. I'm not an outdoorsy type of person, as you might, your listeners can't see me, but I'm sort of a feeble, pale, indoorsy type of person. So I rely on the work of my colleagues in archaeology, but it's absolutely critical to have fluency in it. Because when we're dealing with ancient Greece and Rome, we have so little to go on. We have a lot of text, but it's not like being a historian of, I have some great colleagues here at the College of Charleston who work on the American Civil War. And they've got, newspaper articles and photographs and city records and all of these things that for Greece and Rome, we don't have access to. So you do have to be able to make use of whatever exists. For me, as a historian, that's mostly written stuff, but I do have to understand what the archaeologists have found and be able to compare it with what's in my sources as a way to fact check and contextualize. And then, kind of part and parcel with that, the other part of the equation is that to read those ancient sources, you do have to be very fluent in classical Greek, which is different from modern Greek, and then also Latin. Those are our two big languages.
So how much, so if you're a college student and you're considering a career in the classics, uh, where do you what should you be looking at as far as what your course load is going to look like? What types of things are you going to study? I mean, I studied, you know, I got a history degree from the College of Charleston and focused primarily on American Cold War history. Wealth of stuff there, very easy, you know, to, to find stuff. But uh, tell us if you're going to go into that field, kind of what sort of things you're going to have to study.
Yeah, classics majors do need to do Greek and Latin for the most part. If they're going to do any graduate work, those are essential. And we do encourage students to take those, even if they're not going on professionally in classics, because they're really good for your brain. And as a speaker of English, so many of our words come from Greek and Latin. I think they make you a much better user of your own language. So they'll take Greek and Latin language classes, and then they also get a chance to take history, archaeology, and literature, culture more broadly, which can cover things like mythology. People are really interested in that right now with the new Percy Jackson series. There's a lot of hype around Greek mythology. So yeah, it's a very broad background we give these students. They're learning culture and history from the period of Homer, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is 1200 BC, all the way up through the Christian Roman emperors, which is the fourth century AD or CE. So it's a good like 15, 1600 year swath of history that classic students are expected to learn. So it's a rigorous program, but you get to do a little bit of everything, which is very cool.
So this the period of study that you all have ends during what the 400, I guess what we recognize as the fall of the Western Empire.
Yeah, I usually end my classes in 337, which is when Constantine, the first Christian emperor, dies.
So let me ask you a little bit about, well, here's the background on this next series of things I wanted to ask you about is uh, I was at a soccer game and I was talking to one of the teachers at the school whose son is in the same class as my son, and he mentioned he actually used to do this thing for the lower school program there, where I think in fifth grade they would recreate a historical battle every year. So he would have them do all these, like, I don't think they did the Teutoburg Forest, but they do stuff like that, right? So, and we started talking about Roman history, and he said, one thing people don't realize about kind of the end of the Republic is it was really just a military dictatorship for a long time. And I said, well, I'm not so sure it was just that period. I think if you really look at the whole republic as a whole, given the importance of the dictator, it was probably a dictatorial inclined government for a long time. And I just want to ask you a little bit about that. We would not call, when we use the term Roman Republic, we would not characterize if Rome existed today in that form as a republic, would we?
Well, it's an interesting question because of the way the Republic unfolded. I will say that in its inception and in its idealized form, it would be considered a functioning democratic republic. When Rome was first founded, it had kings. They had seven kings. The last one was sort of tyrannical. His whole family was bad. And so in 509 BCE, they threw out the last king and they established the republic. And they said, we're going to build it on sort of three underlying principles because we never want a king again. A king is a tyrant and an autocrat. So our republic is going to be built on the principle that offices are all elected. So it's going to have this democratic component. All offices are going to be temporary. So everybody we elect, it's a 1 year term, no matter what rank they are, because there's a bunch of them. And no one is going to have power by themselves. Even the highest official we elect, these guys called the consul, which are sort of like your executive branch, they're the highest rank on the ladder of ranks. There's going to be two of them. We are never going to have just one guy with absolute unlimited eternal power. And they put this system into place in 509. And the unbelievable thing about it is totally bananas to me living in 2024 is that it works, actually kind of works for a really long time. There is something called a dictatorship that is also invented about that time. But in its original form, the dictatorship was actually just an emergency measure. It basically said, if we're having a crisis, so if there are a bunch of, scary Gauls trying to invade the city, we can freeze the Republican government and the Senate can elect, and that's like a key part of it, right? The Senate can elect a dictator to replace itself for either 6 months or the duration of the crisis. And at that point, the dictatorship is dissolved. And so they had this military dictatorship, but it was really meant to be used quite sparingly. And until the end of the second century, so until about 130, 120 BCE, the system worked because everybody kind of agreed to follow the rules of it. So I guess that's a long way of saying for much of its history, I think we would probably fairly call it a functioning democratic republic. What happens is that we get to the end of the second century and we get guys who don't want to play ball anymore, who say, right, right, right. Like, that's a nice republic you have there. It's so cool how you have all those rules that limit people's power. But, like, hear me out. What if I just didn't follow those rules? And what if I just refused to leave office at the end of my term? Like, why can't we try that? And what happens? Well, we have 100 years of civil war that bring an end to that republic.
And part of kind of my thought on it was obviously at the beginning there were restrictions on how much wealth you had to have for kind of who rose to the top, and there were, again, and we learned our lesson, so this never happened again. Fights between the haves and have-nots, and the plebeian revolt, or the secession of the plebs and all that sort of thing. So it felt a little more oligarchical when you look back at it. But one thing I was actually curious about is I looked at how common the dictatorship was, and I don't have a good answer for this, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Is the reason that there were so many of them because Rome was just constantly at war with its neighbors, or was it just kind of a crutch that they would fall back on of giving one guy total power? I don't know enough about that, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it was often necessary. The Republican system I just described is sort of lovely because it comes with all of these checks and balances, but it's also extremely ungainly. It's just like a sprawling bureaucracy, which is really inefficient in warfare. And because, as you said, the Romans during this period of growth are constantly at war with their neighbors, there was, I think, a certain demand of necessity to streamline in that fashion. But you raise, I think, a bigger point about human nature and the sort of primal urge that we have to look to one strong, we'll say man, because it's usually a man, right? To look for this one strong
Women
figure.
were not, treated so great back in the
No,
day.
no, they were not big fans of women who wanted power. That usually meant you were a witch. But it's what you just described is actually something that the Romans themselves sort of identified as part of human nature. There's a historian named Polybius who writes in the second century. He is a Greek by birth, saw his people conquered by the Romans and wrote a history about it, basically saying, hey guys, don't feel bad. The Romans are actually pretty awesome, and you shouldn't feel sad that they conquered us because they're better than us. But one of the things that he talks about is like why monarchies emerge over and over again, no matter how many times there are democratic revolutions or oligarchic revolutions. He says this is because we are animals. And just like a wolf pack will look to an alpha male, just like in nature, there's this tendency for one strong figure to take control. We humans do the same thing. And so it is going to recur throughout history. As long as human nature remains the same, we are always going to want one person to be in charge of us. And so I think maybe warfare is the practical reason we keep turning to dictators, but human nature, I think, is the other reason maybe they kept turning to dictators. There's a lot of security in one strong leader. And I think we're often willing to give up a lot of freedom to have that sense of security.
Two things that you bring up there. Before we got started, you were worried that this wasn't going to tie into our normal topic, but you mentioned a Wolfpack, which NC State Wolfpack regular opponent of the Blue Devils. So we've tied in.
Brilliant.
Second, secondarily, you did say human nature, which reminded me one of the other things that I make reference to way too much is The Simpsons. But I remember a line from Sideshow Bob where he became mayor and he rigged an election. And this actually does tie back to Rome pretty well. But anyway, and he rigs an election to become mayor, and he's asked why he did it, and he says, "Because you need me, Springfield. Your guilty conscience may move you to vote Democratic, but deep down you long for a cold-hearted Republican to lower taxes, brutalize criminals, and rule you like a king," which is a very apt description of what happened, in Rome to some extent, right? And human nature to a large degree, but that's so the office of the dictatorship kind of hit its high water mark with Sulla, and then it had kind of gone out of power for a while. And just so everybody's aware, Marius and Sulla were kind of the two precursors to Rome, to Caesar. They went back and forth a little bit, rivals. Sulla came in, reorganized the whole elected path for Roman aristocracy. You had to get, what was it called? The cursus honorum you had to go
Uh-huh.
through. And then he was going to be dictator for life, but he abdicated his power and wrote some memoirs and then died. And Caesar could never figure out why he gave up all that power, which then gives us Caesar.
Yeah, Sulla is sort of remarkable. Exactly as you said, he comes to power in just the most violent, appalling civil war. I mean, there are these vivid descriptions of people carrying heads and pikes around the Capitol after he takes the city, and the vengeance that he exacted on his opponents was merciless. He did these things that we call prescriptions, which is basically state sanctioned executions. His political enemies went on the list, but also just random rich people because he was like, oh, I have a lot of veterans now that did some really bad stuff for me. I need money fast. Let's just kill some rich people. So it's a really sort of violent, terrifying period. Calls himself the dictator, changes the nature of it by making himself dictator for life, sort of stripping it of that failsafe that it's always come with. But exactly like you said, he comes to power, rearranges the political system, and then retires, steps aside, dies, probably very terrible death, it sounds like, of perhaps alcohol poisoning. Although one biographer tells us that he was eaten by maggots from the inside out because his character was so bad. So it's a little ancient medicine for you. But yeah, so he abused the dictatorship, but not as much as he could have. And Caesar looks at that and says, well, yeah, why didn't you stick around and change some more things? And of course, when he tries to do that, it does not end super well for him.
So when when Caesar takes over, he's from all accounts actually concerned about governing. He's concerned about reforms, land redistribution for his veterans, another thing which uh, I guess Octavian, I can't remember what he was called then, but Octavian slash Augustus later realizes you don't want a bunch of angry veterans close to the capital. You want them spread out. He was really good at that. But to go back to our lead in premise about not moderating your worst behavioral instincts, he was really flirting with the idea of I'm going to be a king or I need absolute power. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how he went probably too close to the edge for the Senate's comfort with that?
Yeah, he flies a little too close to the sun, to mix our ancient metaphors. Yeah, as dictator, Caesar's reforms are to the extent that we can judge them because he only gets to be dictator for about 2.5 years before he's assassinated. Everything he took on was incredibly moderate. He purchased land for his veterans rather than executing people like Sulla did. He does not go on any campaign of vengeance against his enemies. He spares people like Brutus, which again does not end very well for him. Um, the sorts of reforms he seemed to be undertaking were things like adjusting the calendar, which was a really important thing to do. They had a sort of modified solar calendar, but they didn't really understand how it worked. And so every couple of years, the Romans would realize that it was like snowing in July. And they're like, oh, our months are off again. Shoot, let's just pretend it's 40 days from now. We'll just change it. And so he, from his time in Egypt, learned how to properly organize a solar calendar. And so this is where the Romans finally got on track with time, instituted some tax breaks, some debt relief, but nothing sort of like vulgarly populist. It was all really moderate. We don't get a sense of what he wanted to achieve as dictator. However, at the same time as his legislation is quite moderate, he also does things like create a priesthood dedicated to himself, which meant that he was technically being worshipped like a god. And the Romans did not do that. There was a really bright line between mortals and gods, really different than some place like Egypt, where the pharaohs were thought to be living manifestations of the gods. The Romans really felt strongly that was not a line that humans should try to cross. He also there's an episode that gets described in the biographers, and it might be in the Shakespeare play as well, where he and his little buddy Mark Antony were at the games, so like a public sport game thing. I don't remember what one it was, but anyhow, he had Mark Antony pretend to crown him to see how the crowd would react. And the crowd was like, "No, boo, don't crown him. We don't want a king." And he was like, "I was just kidding, just seeing how that would go over." So he did seem to be testing the waters. And then in February of 44 BCE, instead of being dictator for 10 years, he declared himself dictator for life. And that seems to be what pushed his enemies over the edge because it's about 6 weeks later he gets assassinated. So, really, really moderate reforms on the one hand, but definitely building a cult of personality at best and a campaign for a monarchy at worst.
And we all learned our lesson and rejected all people who build cults of personality, and history was fine and perfect from there on out.
It's so great that things are so boring now.
One one thing that there's a couple other things I wanted to ask you about. We're probably not going to have time for Sextus Pompey, which I read about your mention of him in one of the articles that you sent me about the modern lie, which was fascinating. And I would like to talk to you about him another time because that opened a thought about his role that I hadn't really given much consideration to before. But I did want to ask you, let's say that you're trying to get started and reading more about Roman history. Where would you go? Give us some stuff for some beginners, some intros, some people like me who are older and we're not in college and we're not in any sort of master's or higher educational program. Where should we start?
Yeah, there are two authors I would name. The first one is a scholar named Mary Beard. She is British. She's a PhD, is maybe still a professor. I don't know if she still teaches, but she is just an incredible sort of public scholar and ambassador for the ancient world. She has a bunch of books, and these are like popular. You can get them on Amazon or in Barnes and Noble. These are really widely available, but definitely written for a not classics PhD audience. They're super fun to read. She has one called SPQR, which stands for Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and People of Rome. That came out a few years ago, so it's probably in paperback and all of that. She has another one called The Fires of Vesuvius, which is about Pompeii, which is just a super cool place that I know people are really fascinated by. So those are my two favorites she's written, but anything Mary Beard has done is great. And then the other author I would name is Emma Sewthon. She is also a British scholar, but not an academic. Got a PhD in classics, but now writes kind of popular history books. And she has a book about murder in ancient Rome called A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. It's so good. It's so nasty. She's a fantastic author, very vulgar. So if anyone doesn't want salty language, that might not be their best choice. But it's a really fascinating sort of study of Roman history and culture through the lens of murder and killing, which the Romans were super into.
In many respects, their main philosophical gifts to the world were warfare related, and in addition to engineering and feats like that, building roads. But a lot of their at least political philosophy was entwined in their military strategy. Correct?
It was. I think the entirety of Roman identity rested on this phrase that comes from a poem called the Aeneid. In this poem, it's a long story, but the founder of what becomes Rome is this guy named Aeneas who like escaped after the Trojan War, and Jupiter, the king of the gods, says, buddy, I know you want to go on all these side quests. See, we come back to the side quests. But you can't do that because you're going to go found Rome, which is going to have Imperium Sine Fine, which means an empire without end or an empire without limit. And that phrase is Roman identity. And so I don't think it's surprising that their legacies to us have been so largely military and conquest oriented because it's a sort of like a manifest destiny idea that they believed the world was there for them to take. And so that I think is why so much of that is filtered down to us because it was so important to them.
And that understanding explains a lot of the early history you hear and read about how only Romans could actually beat Romans, or they were defeated by trickery, or things like that. You know, okay, well, not the case. Second thing I want to talk to you about is books. You have one book that has come out already and another one in the works. Is that correct?
So I have one book on Caesar that's out, one in the works, and then my first book, which came out a few years before those, is about the historian Sallust, who basically is writing about everything that we were just talking about.
All right, and where can we find the book that is out? Where can we go to find that, and what is the title?
Yeah, so the first one is called Sallust's Histories and Triumviral Historiography. If you just put in my last name and Rome in Amazon, you'll probably find it. That one is it's fairly academic. I think it has some really applicable lessons. That's where the modern lie discussion sort of originated. So that's out there. It's fine. But the second one, which I think people might be more interested in, I'm currently on the second volume of a four-volume project translating the Gallic Wars into English. So if anybody wanted to get a chance to read a little bit of Caesar's own writing, I have it's books 5 and 6 are in press now. It's going to be out in paperback in April of this year, but you can get the hard copy now. It comes with a full introduction and a commentary. So anything that's in it you want to know more about, whether it's what kind of javelins are they using, or how did this siege function, or what books did Caesar read that influenced this? There's all of that in there to kind of um, fill out the text itself. And then the books 1 and 2 of that should be out by the end of 2024.
Well, that is fantastic. Send me a link to the right volumes and edition so I can plug that in the post because I remember when I ordered the copy that I got, there were tons to choose from. So we want to make sure we direct it the right way
Yeah,
for
for
that.
sure.
Well, Dr. Garish, you have been kind enough to take some time on a Sunday to talk about a topic that has very little, if anything, to do with what I typically use this platform for, but it entertains me. And to go back to The Simpsons, and in the end, isn't that all that really matters? The answer is yes. Uh, so one thing that I do for all my guests is I give them an open mic to talk about something that they think is important or something that they would like to talk about. So the floor is now yours.
Oh gosh, I think the first thing that comes to mind is something I talk to my students a lot about. As a historian of the ancient world, I spend a lot of time studying how governments break down, but I also spend a lot of time studying how people fought to keep those governments and how people fought to keep their voices in democratic systems. And I think as people in, at least here in the United States in 2024, that I think we could all benefit to reflect on that from time to time, that there are people throughout history who have been willing to make enormous sacrifices to preserve democratic systems. And I think that we should consider what we can learn from those figures in history who fought so hard to keep their freedom to do that.
And there are plenty of examples of those, and the sources are easy to find and look at, and that's always a good topic to consider and give thought to, especially right now as we see all the conflicts all over the place. Folks, as far as programming, Coach Diaz has, I think, almost all of his staff assembled. I'm going to try to get somebody on to talk about that staff, talk about what we can expect. And then future programming note, I may do things a little bit different with the podcast over this winter, spring, and into the summer because my trial calendar for the fall, which is the season, is looking a little rough right now. But we will try to figure that out. So I may have to shake things up a little bit, but that's what happens from time to time. Uh, and I will keep you guys updated on how that goes. In the interim, check us out on the website. You know where to find us. Our DMs are open on Twitter at Duke FB coverage. Send us an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. Check out our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. I know I keep saying this, but we got to get some new old time tunes up for everybody. We've fallen way behind. Again, scheduling difficulties. And these 9 o'clock basketball games, I'm too old for that. I can't do that. 7 o'clock. Come on. I got to be in bed. I got to work the next day. We can't be doing this, guys. Come on. Just like like it was last season. That's what we need to go back to. So let's try to make that happen. And in the interim, let's just hope everything continues to go well in Durham for Coach Diaz and his new staff. And we'll be back here as soon as we can with some more episodes. And until then, as always, go Duke.